Hi everyone. So today is a really big lecture covering Old Persia, Greece, and Rome all in one day, which is kind of ambitious, but that's what our textbook does. And there's a reason for this because they're all related, and these are three empires or kingdoms that occupy a lot of the same spaces physically over time and that kind of bump into each other and take over the same territories. And so this lecture is both covering the Tuesday and Thursday readings for this week. So page 145 to 157 and 158 to 168, the bulk of chapter 7 in your textbook. And then, so this will be a longer lecture today. And then on Thursday, for the Thursday lecture, which I'll probably put out a little bit early, that will cover your object paper, how to find sources, and how to select objects, how to write for this class. That'll be a little bit shorter, probably a 30, maybe 40-minute lecture. So today is one of the more ambitious lectures in the course because it's covering more history than I usually will in one day, although you could say, perhaps the Old Stone Age lecture was the really big one, but more detailed history in one day. And so we're taking really a bird's eye view, a broad overview of this history. As always, you should look at the textbook for a lot of the detail to fill in the things I'm talking about more broadly today. I would like to note just really quickly that these lectures, I am putting them out a couple days early. You don't have to feel pressured to watch these lectures right as I put them out, but I want them to be available ahead of time when possible. I might not always be able to get them out early, just so that you can watch them whenever you have time. So this is a lecture for week 4, and I'm probably going to be putting it up right at the start of week 4, along with the other lecture, if I can get them both out on the same day or a couple days. You'll then have a whole week to watch them before you have to get me your homework and your discussion comments by next Sunday. So next Sunday, which is, the 29th, you'll have another short response assignment, which you will be looking at a lot of the stuff we talk about in lecture today for and in the book today for. So it will be covering Persia, Greece, and Rome. And then you'll have your discussion, the posts for which should be going up around Tuesday or Wednesday of this week. Your fellow students should be putting their questions up to cover I've nominally said that will be a discussion about monotheism and polytheism, or rather polytheism into monotheism, but also talking about just all the stuff from today and all the stuff from chapter 7 in your book, with maybe hopefully a bit of a focus at least on polytheism and monotheism and the significance of those things. I might add a question to that effect if I don't see one go up that covers that. Okay, so to get going, because this is going to be a long one, I'm going to run through these slides. Some of them I will cover in more detail than others, but as always, you can look at the slides yourself. As I'm talking, pause the video, look in more detail, look at the links and things like that. All right, so let's get my face out of the way here. So today, we're covering the Old Persian Empire. There are, of course, other Persian empires that come later, some of them much later, actually after the end of this course in some cases. Early Eurasian military rivalries. So we're going to see the biggest one being the rivalry between the states of Greece and the Persian Empire, which you may be familiar with. Films like 300 kind of cover this. So they are in the popular imagination now. Alexander the Great and putting him in context. And then also the shift from polytheism to monotheism. I'll talk about that a little bit today. And then early Rome and the Roman Empire. Rome is obviously a really big topic. There are whole courses taught just about one or the other of these empires today. There are entire courses about the foundations of Western Civ that talk about Greece and Rome. So really, as usual in this world history, pre-modern world history course, we're talking about a lot of stuff that we could go into much more detail on, but we would need many more weeks to cover it. So we're not going to get to every detail, obviously. And if you're interested in either the Persian, the Greek, or the Roman empires, or how they interact. Those are things you can approach in your discussions, in your papers, and in your short answers to the short answer assignments. Okay, so moving along, I wanted to show you this map. This is a map of the Persian Empire, also known as the Achaemenid Empire. And this is under Cyrus II around 525 BCE. So this is early in the Persian Empire, after the conquest of a large chunk of both the Fertile Crescent, the Mediterranean, parts of what would be Greece, and also heading all the way over to the Indus River, as you can see here. So the Persians under Cyrus II had successfully carved out a huge chunk of land, probably the largest empire in history up until this point. Alexander's empire would be slightly larger, and then we have other empires later that are larger, such as the Mongolian Empire. And this is an empire created by this nomadic group of Iranians or Persians, this Persia is a Greek term for these people, so we're kind of looking at them through the lens of the people that would later unseat them. And this empire lasts for over 200 years, about 220 years according to most histories, although the roots of the Persian Empire go back a bit further to the Neo-Assyrian Empire and a group of nomads that had settled under the Neo-Assyrian Empire in northern Mesopotamia, and then had worked to create their own home in this region under the Neo-Assyrians, and then would later kind of work to topple them. And this takes place over many hundreds of years. This happens from maybe 900 BCE to 550 BCE. The Persians, who were nomadic and still are fairly nomadic, begin to settle and take over land for themselves. So this is a good map for this. The book also has a couple of good maps for this, which I'll show you some of. It's important to remember just the general order of these three empires. So if you can just remember Persia, Greece, Rome, that's the order that you should be remembering. And I want to look at them really briefly from the sidelines, from Egypt. So Egypt has the unlucky fate, I guess you could say, of being conquered 3 times by these 3 empires, by Persia, Greece, and then Rome. So Egyptian history is, I guess you could say, a little bit marred by this set of invasions and takeovers, if you're looking at it from a purely Egyptian standpoint. And there's a really good website here, another one of my maybe slightly old-looking websites, but it's from Colorado State University, and it has, it has a wonderful explanation of this history of Egypt under, especially under Rome, but basically all of Egyptian history. And the history of Egypt under Rome is the Ptolemaic, and this is, under Greece is the Ptolemaic kingdom, and this is a long-lasting kingdom that really shifts Egyptian history. And I wanted to point this out. I really want to talk about Egypt a little bit, because the fact that Egypt was conquered by the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans does not mean that Egypt stopped being Egyptian. It does not mean that it lost all of its internal or individual culture and society were retained, despite the fact that nominally Egypt was under the rule of people who were not historically Egyptians. For example, here on the right, we have this very interesting bust of Ptolemy I, the first, who was both king and pharaoh of Egypt from 304 to 282 BCE. So this is a Greek king who is controlling Egypt. And Alexandria, which we'll hear a little bit more about later today, and which is talked about in your textbook, is this Greek city in an Egyptian kingdom. So Alexandria is the center of Greek culture in Egypt, and the rest of Egypt, and you see Alexandria here in the north, the rest of Egypt along the Nile basically becomes more and more Egyptian and less Greek the further out of Alexandria you go. I think that would be a fair way to put it. And you can learn more about Alexandria here. This ancient history encyclopedia is pretty good. And the Library of Alexandria, which we'll talk about a little bit later, is one of the most famous elements of this place. So it's a center of knowledge and the mixing of information from all around the empire. The last Ptolemaic ruler famously is Cleopatra, who you can read about here. I won't go into too much detail on that. You may have heard of her. She's fairly familiar and fairly well known. But I want to talk more broadly, going back to the Persians, about why they were so successful and what was new about them. First off, there is throughout world history a tendency for nomads and people who move around a lot to find success in taking over sedentary societies. This happens with the Mongols, and we'll see that later. And there are various reasons for that that you might be able to think about. One being that they're highly active. They generally have a larger percentage of their population capable of engaging in military action. They're harder to defeat. They have an easy time getting away from you, and you have a hard time getting away from them. If you live in a town or a walled village or something, and you're being invaded by people on horseback or something like that, you can't really go catch them very easily. They can always run away from you, and you can't really run away from them very well because you're in this singular spot that is your home. So if they want to take over your home, it's a bit easier for them to do that than for you to take over their vast lands of, kind of nomadic settlement or lack of settlement. And so this is definitely the case with the Persians early on. But then why are they so successful in holding this territory for a long period of time, of creating this lasting empire? The answer is really complex. I'll leave part of it to your discussion, but you shouldn't just consider military reasons. You should also consider politics, society, and cultural elements of this empire. And I'll give you just one piece of explanation here, which is the Royal Road. So the Persians in the first Old Persian Empire built this road. It's 1,700 miles long. It basically spans the entire length of their empire, from great cities in the west to great cities in the east, or vice versa. It has lots of post stations along the road, which means you can both get fresh horses, as it says here on the map, but also means it's a fairly safe road to travel. Having these stations every few miles means there's a safe place to stay along this road. And it would take about a week to go across this road if you're moving quickly, if you're not carrying a lot of stuff. And so here, for example, they're talking about with a letter. If you're sending a communication, if you're just traveling without a lot of goods, you could get across the empire in about a week. This is probably part of why the Persians are so successful in creating this large empire, is that traveling throughout it is easier than ever before. This is a model that we'll see followed by Rome. And Rome is very famous for its roads, right? Some of you have probably heard of this. Rome has many roads, but the Persian Royal Road is, in fact, kind of one of them. And the inspiration for creating lots of roads to unify an empire and link it together that the Romans had is probably from the Persians. It's also, ironically, a part of why the Persian Empire falls so quickly to Alexander the Great. Famously, in about 11 years, he's able to essentially wipe out the Persian Empire. And Alexander was both copying Cyrus the great Persian conqueror that made the Persian state possible, and also he's going along this royal road. So if you compare this royal road here to the conquests of Alexander, which are in these red lines here, you can see that, in fact, while he did take some big detours, like into Egypt, he's following the royal road through much of the Persian Empire. And traveling for him was easier because of the royal road and other trade routes. So both a reason why the Persians were successful and why they fell quickly, this travel. Uh, Moving towards Greece, in the 6th century BCE, so this is even before the start or around the time of the start of the Persian Empire, we see a number of statelets or small polities, city-states, that are existing in competition with one another quite regularly, but also in some kinds of cultural collaboration. There is a shared culture among many of these states, shared language, shared belief systems, or kind of emergent belief systems. So although Greece is fragmented, it does still have a lot more in common with itself than with, say, the Persian Empire. And this is important. Much of Greece is fairly dense, as the textbook says, with minimal farmland. Some places have more than others. So from early on, the Greeks had relied on sea trade and sea resources, and this leads to their position as these sea people that we saw very early on in this course, in the second lesson of the course. They were among some of these cultures active on the Mediterranean in boats, who were called sea people and who were causing problems for both the Egyptians and the Hittites, among others. And so their reliance on water is important from early on. So the best way to categorize them, as I said, is that there are many small rival states with a common culture. They have political systems of growing complexity, and these are the earliest quote-unquote democracies in the world. They don't operate the way we think of a democracy today, but they do have the foundational concepts of democracy emerging, and therefore I question, is this a pre-modernity or an early concept of some of the things we consider modern today? This democracy changes over time, but even at its peak, at its most, I guess what we would call equal or fair, no more than a third of the population is participating. It's only men, it's only landholders most of the time, and it is not exactly what we think of as a democracy today. You can read about the details in the textbook. And so the initial invasions by Persians in very early in the 5th century BCE, from 499 to 479 BCE, these early invasions by the Persians prior to the, or around the time of the foundation of the early Persian Empire, but prior to the full takeover of some of the places around the Mediterranean, as the Persians are trying to essentially get as much of the Mediterranean as they can, this unites a lot of the Greek states. So it is this outside force, this outside invasion, that causes some of the rivalries, like the one between Athens and Sparta, which are circled here, to kind of die down, at least temporarily, as the greater threat for some of these rival Greek states becomes this external enemy in the Persians. This is a common theme throughout history. We see this happen in other places. But so ironically, one of the things that probably facilitates the Greek Empire after the Persian Empire is this long-standing rivalry with the Persian Empire that eventually leads to Alexander the Great's attacks and conquest of the Persian Empire. So once again, the invasions by Persia unite the Greek states. And here we have this, what's called the second Persian invasion, one of the largest invasions of the Greek states by the Persians from 480 to 479. So this is right in the middle, towards the end of this period of unity and early unity in Greece. And I won't read this all to you, but here are some of the details, and you have a couple of good websites here, especially this one. This is part of the British Museum. I know it's, once again, kind of an old-looking website, but it has some excellent information about war between Xerxes and the Greeks, which this is the topic of the movie 300, right? But they were already united in some ways in Greece. These states, although they had political rivalries, and some of them were quite intense, quite harsh, quite long-standing, there was still a common culture. One example of this, the biggest example, is the Olympics. So if we go back just a couple slides here, people from throughout the Greek states would meet in Olympia, which was one of the states, for the Olympics, for many hundreds of years, and prior to the war with the Persians. And we have some objects from ancient Greece that describe the Olympics through their imagery. Here we have some vases, some pottery, showing a marathon on the left, which is named for one of the Greek states of Marathon. We have wrestling happening on the right here with a judge, and these are two of the foundational sports that remain essential to the Olympics today and have throughout the history of the Olympics. And here in the center, a little bit more abstract, we have Athena, the goddess of war, with a Pegasus or flying horse on her shield. Now you may be wondering, how is this connected to the Olympics? And it's connected in a couple of ways. First, let's talk about the Pegasus. More specifically, the Pegasus myth, or the idea of the flying horse, comes from chariot racing. So the horse would be essential to chariot racing, and chariot-drawn horses would be running, horses drawing chariots would be running so fast that they would appear to be flying, right? So this is where we get this idea of the winged horse, is that the chariot racers would be, the legendary chariot racers would be drawn by flying horses, and horses appear to fly when they're moving very quickly. So Athena has this Pegasus on her shield to represent chariot racing, and Athena herself, the goddess of war, represents military power, right? And chariots are obviously a military piece of military technology. And all of the sports, in fact, of the early Olympics are related to individual competition and often, to military power or the ability to fight one another. Wrestling is clearly one of those. The marathon, being able to run faster than someone else, is, in the martial sense, a useful skill to have in battle, right? A very useful skill to have in battle. So are all of the old Olympic sports or Olympic events, things like throwing a javelin. This is a military act. This is an act of fighting, using a javelin against your enemy. So I'd like to look quickly at this Met article, The Athletics in Ancient Greece. I think this is a great article to read. It's very short if you're interested in this. And as you look at objects, I'm going to look at the Met a little bit more in our Thursday lecture. One of the great sources, in particular if you're interested in Greece and Rome, is the Met and this Heilbrunn timeline of art history. And there are many of these little essays that you could cite and look at some of the works of art. So you can see I've taken some of these to show you today. And there are many works of art. Each one you click, you get a little bit more information about. You can learn about each object on their own. So this is a great place for your object essays if you're interested in Greece and Rome. I know you don't have to be interested in Greece and Rome, but that's one place you could get some objects. Anyway, the Olympics are evidence of this unified Greek culture. So while Persia's invasion does unify Greece politically, for at least a period of time, both early and late in the Persian Empire, and kind of throughout it, I guess you could say, the evidence of a common culture is also there to facilitate that unity over time. Let's jump to Alexander the Great. And yes, I know I'm only giving the Persian Empire here a few minutes of our time, but that's the way it is. I'm also only going to give the Greek Empire a few minutes of our time. After surviving outside of Persian influence, the ancestors of Alexander the Great are Macedonians, so they're from the north, a little bit further outside of the Greek peninsula here. Philip II is an important unifying figure. He's the father of Alexander the Great, who is able to both unify the kind of almost tribalistic peoples of Macedonia and later conquer all of the Greek states in the mid-300s BCE. So Greece becomes unified, although it was already unified in culture and somewhat unified against the Persians. It becomes much more unified just before Alexander's conquest. And Alexander is leveraging the work his father, Philip II, did to go on his great route throughout the Persian Empire of conquest. So Philip II is assassinated in this political spat that I'm not going to go into detail on, and I don't think the book does either, but you could read about that on your own if you're interested in it. And anyway, the most important thing to our class and to the broader course of world history is that Philip II's son picks up the baton, and now having a unified Greece behind him, drastically expands the empire by attacking the Persians, who had been this 200-plus year-long antagonist, and really running over the Persians throughout their empire. He moves through the Tigris and Euphrates area, through Jerusalem, into Egypt, and then back out, and then throughout what was the larger body of the Persian Empire, all the way over to the Indus River, throughout places like Persepolis. And major battles are taking place all along this route. You can see some of the sites of the battles here. And I took this directly from the text, page 152, if you want to look at these maps a little bit more yourself. Alexander dies of a fever, possibly something contracted in one of the places with unfamiliar diseases. You know, this is one of the consequences of travel in the early pre-modern or ancient period, is that when you go to a new place, you probably have no immunity from those diseases that they have there. This is famously the case with the Native Americans and the Europeans, who bring diseases to them much later on, towards the end of this course. This happens to other people throughout history. It's probably the reason for multiple plagues throughout history, is contact across the globe. So Alexander catches something when he's over in the east, and he does eventually die of fever after 11 years of continual conquest. After that, Alexander's generals split up his empire into a number of kingdoms, but three major ones: the Ptolemaic, which we already talked about, the Greek-Egyptian kingdom, the Seleucid in the east, and the Antigonid in kind of the core of Greece and Macedonia. If you want to learn more about the elephants, I'm not going to talk about this today, but here is a nice article about the Battle of Hydaspes, which is one of the big battles of Alexander's conquest, and it's where he famously runs into Persian war elephants, I think for the first time, right? So the major time he'd run into them. He probably knew about these elephants ahead of time, but it was probably a bit surprising the first time he fought them. Later he would have some himself. Let's look really quickly at this edict known as the Priene inscription, or the Edict of Alexander to Priene. This is a dedication of a temple. This is what this is doing. What this inscription is saying is this temple is being dedicated to Athena, the goddess of war, which is done after the Battle of Granicus. However, while often misinterpreted as being something carved under Alexander's order himself, it was actually made after his death, which is a significant distinction. If you want to learn about the Battle of Granicus, this ancient history encyclopedia is very good for these individual battles, if you're interested in them, if you're interested in military history. Unfortunately, we don't have time to really go into each battle here. But the Priene inscription is something that for a very long time was seen as evidence of Alexander's direct intervention in life in the East, life in the former Persian homeland, Persian Empire homeland. And in fact, it was made probably by one of his lieutenants or generals, who's called Lysimachus. I'm not sure if it's Lysimachus or Lysimachus or Machus. But here's an article. If you're interested in this stuff, you can read this article directly. It's available through our CUNY access, and I'll be talking to you about how to get articles on Thursday. But you can get the entire article to read yourself. I'm not going to read all this to you, but this person, writing in, I think, 1985, really points out and found that this inscription is in fact known by experts not to be by Alexander himself, but rather to be made by one of his generals and essentially serving as a public archive of texts related to the Greek conquest of Persian territory, and that it is important to consider the authorship of something like this, and you can read all about this yourself, but that the association of the AE, as they call it, Alexander's Edict, with Alexander himself is not necessarily true, and that a lot of what has been attributed to Alexander in his conquest in terms of state building was actually stuff that was carried out by his followers. So this is an important distinction, but I won't go too deep into this. Alexander himself, in his large empire, which fragments very quickly after his death, is maybe a bit of a roadmap for the larger empire that follows from Rome, or I shouldn't say larger because in terms of physical territory, I'm not sure which one is bigger, but they're about the same size. But Rome is more enduring and has a longer lasting impact on a larger chunk of land than Alexander's empire did. So unlike Alexander's conquest, Rome expands fairly slowly. A few hundred years later, it peaks around 117 AD or CE. So now in the system of, we're now past the BC AD or BCE CE split. Pretty much for the first time in this course, we're getting into the last 2,000 years of history. And some areas of Rome, like the empire of the Greeks, are provincialized, meaning they're not fully under Roman control, especially not throughout the history of the Roman Empire. But this provincialization is more substantial than in past empires, and places that are or are not in part of the Roman Empire. At the very end of this class, of this lecture, I'll have a GIF for you that shows the rise or expansion and contraction or fall of Rome. And although Rome really blows up and then starts to shrink thereafter, after 117, that even though it's shrinking, the places Rome had influenced remain more significantly linked to Roman culture, Roman civilization, than in previous empires, both Persian and Greek. So as the textbook states, the Roman Empire technically begins in 27 BCE, but its real roots go back at least 300 years before that, if not a little bit earlier, as the state of Rome was founded earlier than that, here in the Italian peninsula. And the roots for many of these empires are in fact significantly older than the technical start of this empire. Under the Roman Empire, we have some new and more substantial efforts at state building, which is part of why the Roman Empire lasts significantly longer. And one of these is that provinces pay taxes to the center. Even places that are not really part of Rome pay taxes to the center. These are used to enhance the center of the empire, to pay for things like government, to pay for major public buildings, etc. Roads run throughout the empire. So as I said earlier, taking an example from the Persians, the Romans build even more roads substantially. And the famous adage, all roads lead to Rome, really comes from this expansion of this Roman road network. The rule of the Romans is by military might, and the book compares Rome to Han China, but it's also, you could say that the same thing is true for the Greeks and the Persians before them, but that this rule by military might also includes a large cultural influence. So while there is state power directly applicable through violence, there's also cultural power through this Roman Empire. And you can see that through things like coinage. Roman coins are used long after Rome has receded from this large-scale empirical map we see here. Things like Roman coins are still in use because the power of Roman culture remains, even after Rome recedes. Historians create this idea of a Pax Romana, or Roman peace, We'll talk about this maybe a little bit later in the term, but the book talks about it, and you can click here to learn a little bit more. There's this section of this book that is kind of interesting, talks about the Pax Romana. There are other paxes, a number of others, at least a half dozen of them. The notable one we will talk about a bit later, the Pax Mongolica, because as you know, I love the Mongolians and the Mongolian Empire. I find them fascinating as someone who studies Japan and China. And so the Pax Mongolica is a comparable one where this creation of a great empire brings with it a kind of peace that is previously unknown, meaning to travel somewhere far away is safer and more reliable than ever before anywhere else in history. And this is quite significant. So the Pax Romana is something you can read about a little bit and that our book talks about a little bit. So although Rome as a city-state or as a settlement was formed around 1000 BCE, this republic that we think of today, which also brings some of our modern political values with it, starts from about 500 BCE. And then we have the establishment of Roman law, which we could kind of compare to Hammurabi's Code in its significance historically, which is the 12 tables. I think our book might misprint it as the 12 tablets, but it is called the 12 tables of Roman law, which are created in 451 BCE and kind of continue to be significant to the Roman Empire thereafter. So this is well before the foundation of the Roman Empire that they have these laws in place. I've included a few of them here. These are just individual examples from these tables. And so there are 12 tables. I'm not showing you all of the tables. And within them, some of them have a dozen laws or a dozen, kind of chunks of these tables that they use to create their legal system. So let's go ahead and read a couple of these. I'm not going to go through all of them, but in table 1, just a really foundational one, is that in a trial, if one of the parties does not appear, the magistrate shall adjudge the case after noon in favor of the one present. So part of their legal system is you have to show up for trial or you will automatically lose. That's an interesting one. Table 2, matters dealing with trial, is that whoever needs evidence shall go every third day to shout before the doorway. This is of the court building. So as you're finding evidence for a trial, if the trial is delayed because you are finding evidence, you have to check in every 3 days to let them know what's happening. So there is some element of both evidence gathering as being critical to the trial and an element of the need for a speedy trial, that you can't delay your trial by just saying, oh, I'm looking for evidence, I'll get back to you in a year or something. You have to both find evidence quickly and show evidence that you are in fact continuing to do your work on pleading your case or finding the materials you need to do so. Table 3, the execution of judgment, and I think this will be the last one I talk about, is that 30 days shall be allowed by law for payment of confessed debt and for the settlement of matters adjudged in court. So some of the settlements in the law here would involve paying someone, and you have a limited amount of time to do that. So some of the things we see in our modern legal system, just like with Hammurabi's Code, you can trace back all the way to Roman law. There is perhaps more of a sense of equality than we see in something like Hammurabi's Code, which had a much more distinct sense of class, but there is still a distinct sense of high and low in Roman law, especially with unfree people versus free people. This is still the case in Roman law. And also, just to add one more here on table 8, we see some more links to things like Hammurabi's Code in part 2 of table 8, which is that if anyone has broken another's limb, there shall be retaliation in kind unless he compounds for compensation with him. So if I break your arm, I must talk to you through the court about how to compensate you, and if we cannot come to an agreement, my arm will be broken. So there's still a sense of eye for an eye justice here, just like we saw directly from Hammurabi's Code, the source of eye for an eye justice. So I thought talking about the 12 tables would be useful. Roman art is quite significant in learning about Rome, so objects from Rome are a good one to pick for your object papers if you want. And the Met's Greek and Roman art exhibit is a really good place to start. I've already talked about that a little bit, and I'll talk about that a little bit more on Thursday. But just to point this out and give you another link to it here. Decline in early Rome. So why does Rome start to shrink, into the 2nd and 3rd and 4th and 5th century CE? There's really a notable kind of shrinking of the Roman Empire over time. Some of the reasons are things like short-lived rulers. The peak of the Roman Empire is kind of denoted by a series of very good emperors, 5 good emperors. And the period of decline, one of them that we see here from 235 to 285 CE, is marked by a lot of short-lived rulers. And you can see, I thought it was interesting to see how they died here. A lot of the time it is by assassination, right? So the political intrigue of the Roman court involves the killing of high-level political figures, as you may be familiar with Julius Caesar. And here is a long list of people who are the rulers of Rome for only a year or two, or in some cases a few years longer than that. But we have about, I don't know, 15 or 20 rulers here in the course of just 50 years. It's not a great track record for big chunks of the Roman Empire. Other reasons are nomadic invasions, and the term barbarian is used quite a lot. These invasions come from all directions, often from the steppe, from Central Asia, also the Goths and people like that from parts of Europe are famously invading Rome regularly throughout the decline of the Roman Empire. Also things like disease and plague. You can see one of the rulers, Claudius Gothicus here, dies of plague. And diseases and plagues, as you know from right now, the spread of coronavirus can have a really strong impact on a state's ability to be effective in terms of its governance. And so we have a plague here in 251, possibly, and a plague here in 260 or 270, and probably several others. So the presence and prevalence of disease in urban society is a consistent issue for the Romans and for other urban societies. And this is the nature of the spread of disease, right? There are 2 big factors here. First being that the concentration of a lot of people in a small area leads to the spread of disease. I know as New Yorkers, we're all feeling this right now. And also early urban society in particular has problems with unsanitary conditions and kind of a lot of spread of disease through grime and dirt and the kind of unclean nature of a long-standing city with a lot of people in it without modern cleaning and maintenance services. And in addition to that, the second big reason is that the Roman Empire, spanning such a large area and having people traveling throughout it, means bringing disease from other places to these central cities. Talking a bit about polytheism and monotheism in the Roman world, we start to see the development of monotheism under the Romans, famously, Jesus Christ. And I'm not going to talk a lot about Jesus Christ in this course. It's more of a religious history topic. And I just want to talk broadly about the shift from polytheism to monotheism. Like Greece, Rome was mostly polytheistic. Here we have the Council of Gods by Raphael down at the bottom. And this is rather well known, right? There are lots of gods in Greece and Rome. Gods for the ocean, gods for war, gods for love, gods for various things you see in the sky, gods of lightning and thunder, etc. And Rome absorbed new gods through conquest, like the Mongols did. And a question I might ask you is, why absorb new gods? I'm not going to answer that. I think that might be, if I add a question to our discussion, that'll be the question I add. We'll see if someone else asks it. Monotheistic religions including Judaism and Christianity, are on the rise under the Roman Empire. And the 5 books of the Torah are actually much early, come from much earlier under the Persian Empire. They're compiled from the 4th to 5th century. The exact date of the compilation, the first compilation of the Torah, is a bit fuzzy, and the Jewish faith extends hundreds of years before that. Christianity is really a Jewish reform movement solidified in the 1st century CE after the death of Christ. And Christians were initially, as we know, as many of you probably know, heavily persecuted. Throw the Christians to the lions, being a rather famous thing from Rome, and were not legally accepted in Rome until Emperor Constantine in 1313 put out the Edict of Milan, which you can read here, I think in its entirety, or a large chunk of it. And so if you want to learn about the persecution and rise of Christianity, I'll just leave this here for you. And there are, of course, lots of other sources, but this is a nice short one that you could look at from PBS. Talking about Greco-Roman equivalent deities, a lot of the gods from Greece are adopted by Romans or adapted by Romans. They usually have different names. Apollo is one example of one that has the same name in both. And here you have some of their titles, the things they're related to, as well as their symbolism, their symbology, which is often the same and usually the same between the Greek and Roman versions of these gods. You could read more about this here. This is a good comparison of Greek and Roman gods. Anyway, we don't have time to get into a lot of depth on this, but I thought I would mention to remind you of this because most of you already familiar with this idea of many gods for many different things in the Greek and Roman, especially early Roman world. To talk just briefly about the shift to monotheism, this is a significant development, and I'm not going to step too much on your discussion here, but one thing to think about is how the shift to monotheism might change politics in Rome. For example, if you are a Roman emperor, you might early on in the Roman Empire, before the legalization and acceptance of Christianity in 1313, you might talk about the support of various gods for the things you're doing, for your rule. And this reminds us a little bit of the mandate of heaven, right, from China. Whereas under monotheism, you might talk more about your devotion to that singular God. So there is a shift from the support of the gods to you, their support for you, to the support you are giving to the gods or to the singular God after the shift from polytheism to monotheism. So there's a political element here. Our textbook talks briefly about that, and I'll let you get to that on your own, because I just want to get through this lecture. I don't want to spend too much time, and you are going to spend a whole discussion on religion and how it's related to Greece and Rome and Persia. The growth of scientific study is also quite significant in the Greek and Roman world, especially under, also under the Persians, especially under Rome. It really expands. But we have ancient Greek philosophy, people like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, whose approach to the world is actually fairly scientific if you look at some of their writings. And so the approaches of early philosophers are related to the foundations of science, because science does have within it a great deal of philosophy about things like evidence and reason and logic. And this is a lot of what ancient Greek philosophers cover. And so the logic of early science draws from philosophy, and these two are not really separate ideas at that time. You wouldn't have a separate philosophy and science department. The philosophy department would be the science department if CUNY were to exist back in the days of Greece and Rome. There are some good links I've given you here about the Library of Alexandria. This is a particularly good one. And you can see that the Ancient Library of Alexandria here is being talked about by the American Association for the Advancement of Science, right? So the Library of Alexandria is deeply connected to early scientific knowledge and the production of that knowledge. Things like anatomy, astronomy, geography, geometry, etc., mathematics are gathered in the Library of Alexandria, which is in northern Egypt, as I talked about earlier. And this Library of Alexandria exists for about 700 years in various states. It occasionally has losses. There are occasional fires and other pieces of the library are destroyed, but it exists for about 700 years, and it is the center of knowledge in the Western world, at least, throughout that period. Famously, the Library of Alexandria burned thereafter, and the knowledge within it was largely lost. This is stuff you could study on your own for a paper if you're interested. I think it'd be a great topic to look at. Roman coins, and I'm just going to lay this in the background. This is an excellent set of examples of Roman coins. And I already talked about this just a little bit, but long after the Roman Empire really started to fall apart and decline and shrink down, as we'll see in a minute, Roman coins were used throughout Eurasia and Africa, in part because they were verifiable and well known, right? So one reason you trust a Roman coin is you know what it is. You've seen it before. Other people put value into it. And this gets to the core of why money has value. Right? Money is a kind of shared social contract at the end of the day, especially if the value of the money is worth more than the metal or paper itself. Today, when I give you a $1 bill, the paper it is printed on is worth pennies or less, but we all agree that it's worth $1, right? If I give it to you, you can go get $1 of stuff with it. And this is also the case with Roman coins. Their value exceeds the sheer material worth of the metal within them, and they are used to trade for other goods at a fairly reliable rate. It's not exactly like having $1, but it's a fairly reliable rate. And we'll see this also with Chinese coins a little bit later in the term. A similar thing happens with Chinese coins and Roman coins, which is that their use exceeds the geographical scope of the empire, and so these coins are a symbol of the influence of Rome outside of its borders. The exact same thing happens with China, as Chinese coins are used in, for example, in Japan, for purposes they are not meant for in China. China actually goes through a copper shortage because of the demand for coins from China in Japan, because they're seen as a reliable medium of exchange. So the minting of coins for an empire can really expand the breadth of the influence of that empire. And this is also really great if you're trying to be a legitimate empire, to have legitimacy. Just say, I'm the emperor of Rome, and my empire, although its borders end here, in this part of Egypt, the coins from my empire are trusted and used throughout northern Africa or throughout northern Europe, far outside my borders. And this is evidence of the stability and power of Rome. The same thing happens with China later. And so this is a very useful way to think about coins as an extension of culture and political power. Coins, another great topic if you want to look at them. Talking a little bit about later Rome, as we start to try to wrap up today's lecture. The Roman Empire shrank over time. It lasts, although it's shrinking, and although it peaks in the 2nd century AD or CE, it actually lasts through the end of this course and the fall of Constantinople, which is a famous conquest. Here we see Mehmed II conquers Constantinople, that should say. Sorry, I've mistyped it there. And this is a modern painting of this conquest, and it is the destruction of the capital of Rome. The end of the 4th century CE sees Rome split in half, rather famously, into an eastern and western state, with a court at each one of these states. This is really, this precipitates the decline of the Roman Empire quite a bit. So when Rome splits in half, that is a real sign of kind of disunity and failure at the center, and of the pressures Rome is feeling both internally and externally, which sees it shrink down. This animated GIF that I have for you on the bottom left of the screen here is really great if you want to see how the empire expanded and contracted. It gives you a very good sense of the kind of slow burn of Rome building up and then falling down over time. And this is quite different from the expansion of Alexander the Great in particular, in that Rome takes a long time to build up and then an even longer time to collapse down. So the greatness of Rome is in part, at least, represented by its duration, its durability as an empire. We'll return to the Roman Empire periodically throughout this course as we kind of study other regions and times that will interact with that, with it. If you want to look at even more maps, this is an article. It's from Vox, which I know is a heavily politically source, but these are maps of ancient Rome, so they don't have that much politics in them. And these are just a number of great maps that I really like. I mean, you may have noticed there are a ton of maps in today's lecture and throughout this course. Maps do a good job of telling you the broad strokes of ancient and pre-modern history. So if you want to look at a few more maps, these are some good ones. So that about wraps it up for today. I'm trying to keep this as short as I can. Our next lecture for Thursday will be about our museum project, and the mission object is actually going to come later. I'm going to talk about that, I think, the week after this week. But I'm going to tell you about how to find sources, how to find and then for the 29th, just to remind you, I want to see all of your student-led discussion responses online for the kind of Greek, Rome, Persia, and also spirituality, polytheism, monotheism discussion. The discussion leaders for this week, I want you to have your questions up by really Tuesday night would be great. Wednesday morning is okay too, the 24th or 25th, so that everyone has time to respond to you by Sunday night. And then also, I will have your short response assignment online. I'll send you an announcement about that once it's ready here this week. Probably by about Tuesday at the latest, I will have it ready for you. It will look a lot like quiz number 1 without the map component. I don't think there will be a map component every week, but we will have that, that assignment up, and that is also due on Sunday. Okay, so thanks very much, everyone. I hope this was contained enough for you to learn about Persia, Greece, and Rome. I'm sorry it's such a big topic, but this is world history, so we have to take on these big topics and get through to the next era, the next period, the next place. And it is unfair to focus too much on one place just because you know, we like it more than another. So all you Greek and Rome fans and Persian Empire fans, I hope this was enough for you, and we'll see you next time.